She fed a homeless woman and lost her job. Then the Mafia boss walked in and called her mother. The rain had been steady all evening, a steady hiss that filled the alleys and made the city smell like iron and wet concrete. Inside the dining room, the light was warm. There was the clatter of plates, the sweet bubble of conversations, and the faint perfume of garlic and butter. While outside, a woman on the curb shivered with a paper bag for a blanket and the sea of umbrellas patrolled by indifferent feet. Maria Alvarez moved without thinking, the apron at her waist damp where the kitchen steam met the cold air, and did the one thing her hands could do quickly and without asking permission. She ladled 2 bowls of soup, wrapped them in foil, and stepped out into the rain. It was a small thing, a warm spoon, a soft voice saying, "Here, eat," for a woman whose teeth clicked when she smiled. Small things sometimes cost a lot. Within an hour, Maria handed back her apron, her name on a termination slip, and a manager who said the word sentimental as if it were a crime. She did not know then that the woman she had fed would pull at threads that reached into boardrooms and basements, that would wake a man who kept an entire neighborhood in his pocket, and that the name he would use for her would be both blessing and burden. How could a bowl of soup be a beginning and an accusation at once? Where would protection become payment and kindness become a ledger entry? The dining room that night had tasted like rosemary and lemon oil. The lamps hummed a low note, the vinyl booth gave a soft sigh as patrons shifted, and a violin from a busker 2 blocks away threaded through the conversation. Maria moved past a table where Evelyn Park, a local event planner, tapped her manicured fingers, and Henry Marks, a broker in a dark suit, sipped a Merlot and did not look up when the door opened. Marcus, the maitre d', scooped his chin with judgment when he saw the foil package in Maria's hands. She smelled the wood polish of the hostess stand and the bleach at the kitchen sink, felt the damp of the apron on her wrist, tasted the salt of the stock in her mouth, and heard the hollow clack of heels on tile as she crossed the threshold. The homeless woman said thank you with hands that trembled and eyes that had lost the habit of trusting meals. And Maria, 28 years old, a line cook with a baby niece she watched on weekends and rent that grew like a shadow in her mind, did not hesitate. She had an overdue bill, yes, a cousin counting on babysitting money, time off requests denied, and the small but constant pressure that millions of people know, the slow stretching of a life, until it might break. It felt insignificant in the face of human hunger. Yet significance turned on a dime. Marcus saw the exchange, Evelyn said something under her breath, others watched the drama of intimacy in a polished room. When the manager came out, his face was red and he used the word liability. The foil was evidence. The customers were the jury. Maria folded her hands for a breath, and then the word terminated and a pile of staff uniforms in a box by the back door. The city, with all its noise and secrets, watched a small injustice and moved on, but the ripple had only just begun. The immediate fallout played like a clip chain. Marcus, the maitre d', paced the floor with a tightened jaw, while Chef Marco held a ladle like a baton and searched for words that would not make him scapegoat. Evelyn Park called a friend to complain and named the restaurant in a group chat. Henry Marks sent a dismissive thumbs up to someone who worked in PR and used the emoji of a smirk. In the back, Rosa, the dishwasher, whispered to Daniel, the young line cook, that the owner would sweep problems under the market day rug. Dialogue rose in quick stabs. Marcus asked Maria, "Why did you do that? Why did you give out food without approval?" She said, "I could not just leave her there." Marcus said, "You put our license at stake." Maria said, "I know, but she was freezing, and I could not leave her." Rosa said, "We are all exhausted, but this is different." Daniel said, "Maybe we can ask for a donation." Marco said, "Do not make me defend our plates to people who spend $300 on wine and call it charity." Marcus said, "The customers will complain. We cannot have a scene." Evelyn said, "I will post about this on my feed and people will choose sides." Agent after agent of social pressure moved like a wind. The word unemployment pressed against Maria like a physical weight. She left with a paper bag of her coat and 2 texts from her sister reminding her about rent, and a voicemail from her niece laughing with a sugar high, proof of the ordinary life that kept pulling her back. Word traveled the way modern small towns do, some through gossip, some through feeds, some by the mouths of people who like to place blame. The restaurant received messages, a review or two that said rude staff and worse, and an anonymous complaint filed with the local public health inspection board claiming improper food handling for takeout outside licensed hours. The complaint landed like a stone. An inspection was scheduled. The inspector was named Carlos Diaz, and he arrived with a clipboard, a badge, and an expression that suggested he had seen the city season by season. His pen scratched over boxes, he smelled the grease trap, listened to the hum of the fridges, and took notes that smelled like consequence. The owner, Scott, tried to reassure the staff, his voice a curated calm. He said to Maria, "You should not have done that. You endangered our business." Maria said, "I did what I could." Scott said, "Customers will not tolerate this." And he was right and wrong at the same time. The inspection report later would be an administrative document, 3 pages that cited training logs and storage temperatures, but the symbolic damage was already done. Someone in the restaurant had been seen as careless, and careless people do not belong behind pristine plateware. The woman, Maria fed, had a name, a tag of a human story. Her name was Lillian Ortiz, and she slept under a bus shelter 3 blocks from the restaurant, a place that smelled of diesel and old newspapers and had the steady rhythm of trains passing in the night. Lillian had survived a house fire years earlier, a job lost to a company downsizing, and a family that had not had room to help. She had taught a Sunday school 40 years before and could still recite hymns in her sleep. When Maria handed the foil bowl, she did not know that Lillian once had been a matriarch to a street of people who remembered her. Lillian ate slowly, fingers worn on the foil, closing her eyes like someone rewinding to a safer season. Her gratitude was blunt and sincere. She said, "God bless you, mija," and repeated the phrase like a prayer, like a contract. Later, in the hours after Maria left, Lillian walked through a dim passageway and into a doorway she had avoided for years, a private club that opened late, with a carpet that swallowed footsteps and paintings that told stories of control. She climbed the staircase with the foil folded in her pocket and placed it on a side table. She kept thinking of Maria and the bowl. That small charity would become a thread. Enter the man, the neighborhood called Santoro, though few ever used his full name. Lorenzo Santoro was a man with a wardrobe that whispered money in the same breath as threat, a voice that could comfort and command in the same sentence, and a reputation the city mapped like a coastline of fear. He had the air of someone who handled problems by rearranging people and accounts, and he loved order in places where chaos was profitable. He could have been called a godfather by those who wrote dramatized headlines, but to locals, he was the godfather in the real sense, a man who took care of people in exchange for his kind of allegiance. Lillian had known Lorenzo. Once he had been a neighbor who smoothed ways and paid a repair bill, a man who had helped her son find work. Now he lived in an orbit that touched city managers and suitcases, and the muted nods of those who owed him favors. When Lillian entered his club that night, she did not plan to speak of Maria. She merely wanted to be somewhere warm. Yet she could not stop talking about the soup and the girl who had risked her job and said, "He fed me like I was family." Lorenzo listened, fingers steepled, and he looked at the foil and then at a photograph on his wall of a young woman clapping at a street festival. He felt a tug he had not felt in years, the shape of a memory of his mother, a woman who had kept a small kitchen and shared soup with neighbors without counting profit. Memory is a volatile engine. It started the night he called his driver, had a man named Paulo look up a name, and ordered quietly, "Find her." The scale tipped in ways the public would not immediately follow. Lorenzo had resources and a kind of discretion. He could make a donation without a press release, and he could buy silence without a contract. Yet he did not move like a purchaser of favors. He moved like someone who had found a name he liked. The next day, Maria found a text on her phone, a single line from an unknown number that read, "Meet me at Santoro House tonight." She almost deleted it, and then her curiosity overcame caution. She borrowed a neighbor, Rose's umbrella, and walked with a nervous pocket of courage through rain-chopped light and puddles. She did not know what to expect. Protection, offer, retribution, confusion. When she walked into a low-lit room with velvet chairs and a woman named Angela from a community charity polishing a glass, and a man named Daniel, the accountant for a local union, glancing at the doorway, she realized the world was not needed to be explained. It simply rearranged around her. Lorenzo stood up and smiled in a way that felt like both balm and trap. He said to her, "You fed someone, and they told me your name." Maria said, "I did what any decent person would do." Lorenzo said, "You could have lost everything." Maria said, "I already did lose everything." Lorenzo said, "Not everything." He looked at her as if cataloging an oddity, and then he said, "You remind me of someone." He called her mother in a tone that made the room tilt. It was not a joke. He said, "Mother," in English, and then in a softer Spanish, "Madre," and the room hummed with the sound of a label being placed on a life. The meeting turned into negotiations, and there are moments when kindness and intimidation sit on the same table and pass the cutlery. Lorenzo proposed to help pay Maria's outstanding debts, to put a quiet sum into the restaurant's ledger to protect their license, to issue an anonymous donation to a shelter in Lillian's name, and to offer a small position to Maria as a coordinator for a pilot community kitchen program he wanted to begin. Fund. He spoke of the idea in calm sentences, using words like dignity and rescue and community kitchen, and he framed the offer as restoration. Maria sat with a mouth that tasted like the soup she had given. She listened to Daniel the accountant explain how a transaction could be structured to look like a charitable grant, and to Angela describe how the community kitchen could reach a forgotten block. The dialogue moved between pleasant and edged shapes. Maria asked, "Why would you care?" Lorenzo said, "My mother taught me to feed people, and sometimes debts of the heart are heavier than financial debts." Maria said, "What do you expect in return?" Lorenzo said, "Nothing formal." He looked down at his hands, then up again and said, "Only that you let me protect the people you help." Maria said, "Protect how?" Lorenzo said, "In whatever way protects most for me and for them." The words protection and debt threaded together. To accept meant immediate relief, but also opening a door to an influence that would not stay on the page of paperwork. She thought of Lillian and of her niece and of rent notices and of the public shame of being fired. The offer mattered in a practical way. The city had built systems that punished small mercies and rewarded detachments. The man could clear her name with a call, make sure the inspection yielded excuses rather than penalties, and place a quiet check in her account that would stop the late notices. The cost was undefined. At this point, a public relations ripple returned. The restaurant owner, Scott, received a financial note that settled the inspection findings and paid a fine anonymously. The inspector Carlos Diaz wrote a shorter report. A donation showed up listed as anonymous at the shelter where Lillian occasionally slept, and a small card read, "For the table of Maria, with gratitude." Journalists sniffed at a story that might be about corruption, but the paper that usually lifted headlines found instead a string of small kindnesses without a single contract traceable, and Lorenzo's network had practice in erasing footprints. Meanwhile, a rival man named Antonio, who ran another circle of influence and saw Santoro as a competitor for neighborhood control, started to ask questions. He hired a man called Felipe to follow loose threads and see who would accept what. Tension is a living thing. Antonio called a meeting at his own club and said, "Do not let Santoro take the narrative." He wanted to keep the neighborhood in a different orbit. He decided to remind people that favors come with price tags and that muscles in his world beat silence into people.
Antonio sent a messenger down the street to the restaurant and asked a question aloud in a bartered tone. What does Santoro want with a woman who gives soup? He meant to imply that anyone who took Santoro's charity was indebted to futures that could be called in. The consequences escalated.
Into danger. One night, as Maria walked home from a second meeting where Lorenzo had arranged a modest stipend and offered the community kitchen position, she felt steps behind her. Two men called out a friendly hello and quick curiosity. They tried to steer her down a narrower lane under a blown-out streetlight. The city smells shifted to wet oil and old trash, her heartbeat a counter-percussion. She said, "Who are you?" She said, "Leave me alone." He said, "No need for drama." He moved closer. She pushed away and shouted for help. A neighbor leaned out an upstairs window and called down, "What are you doing?" They stopped, laughed, and walked off. Later, she would say, the feeling of being watched was worse than the shove. This was an initial moment of threat, but not yet assault. The next time was worse. The calls started at night, a voice that said, "We know where you live, and we are patient." She reported it to the police, and Inspector Diaz filed a report. The recordings were vague, and the police were constrained by workload and evidence. Antonio's men were showing muscle. This was a moment of true fear, a small storm that presses down on everything you love. In two short paragraphs that unfold to a crescendo, Maria realized protection might require being close to the force that offered it, even if that force had its own ledger. These moments of tension are not just dramatic beats, they are where the cost is revealed. In one of those moments, Maria heard a muffled cry in the alley behind her building and ran without shoes to find Lillian held in a doorway by two men who thought her a bargaining chip. Maria called out names, kicked, pulled, and someone from the building, a man named Daniel who delivered packages, came at the noise with a crowbar. A neighbor, Angela from the charity, called for an ambulance at the same time. The scuffle ended with bruises and a sense like a held breath being released. Renaissance in a city is messy. Lillian was shaken and said, "They wanted something I do not have, and they thought I knew where to find it." The men had been searching for proof of Lorenzo's payments disguised as charity and were angry that their assumed leverage slipped. At that moment, Maria realized the small gesture of soup had been interpreted as the start of a resource chain, and that those who watched opportunity had chosen to use violence to access it. The rescue that followed had technical steps that would be recorded later. The police took statements, assigned a case number, and opened an investigation into the intimidation and assault. The investigator recorded witness accounts, collected CCTV footage, and sent evidence to a digital forensics unit for voice analysis. A restraining order was secured through a municipal clerk, and emergency funds were provided by Angela's charity to cover immediate medical checks. The process involved paperwork with timestamps, notarized signatures, and a chain of custody log for the physical evidence like the torn scarf and the foil bowl. A parallel financial process occurred as Lorenzo arranged an electronic transfer that would show as an anonymous grant to a nonprofit account. Accountant Daniel drafted a short memo explaining the origin of funds and the intended allocation to community kitchen expenses. The memo was attached to a bank wire protocol with a 3-day clearance and an instruction for the bank compliance officer to flag the donation as philanthropic. These procedural steps made the public surface look smoother, though underneath there were human costs. The description of these actions is necessary not to romanticize, but to give credibility to how rescue and protection are operationalized in the intersection of charity and power. After the rescue, Lorenzo appeared in the hospital corridor as if fate and his chauffeur had worked together. He visited Lillian and Maria and introduced himself with a hand that was both precise and warm. He said, "You two are part of what matters." He told the nurse to make sure both got tea and blankets, and his men arranged for a social worker named Naomi to begin paperwork to enroll Lillian in a temporary shelter program with dignity checks and the possibility of a small stipend. Naomi spoke softly to Lillian and used words like transition plan and support circle. She wore a name badge that said City Outreach and had images of boxes of meals in her head. Maria listened to Lorenzo and felt something shifting under the floorboards of her life. He placed his hand on her shoulder, and in front of the bright hospital lights and the smell of antiseptic, he said, "I will take care of what you cannot hold." It was a promise that was both protection and potential bondage. He asked her to lead a pilot program for a community kitchen in a block that had been neglected. He said, "It will be a place where people can come and eat without questions, where dignity returns to the table." Maria paused and asked, "Why me?" Lorenzo said, "Because you practiced what many preach and could not wait for permission." The program launched with fanfare that was subtle. Angela from the charity prepared flyers. Naomi coordinated volunteers. Daniel helped set up bookkeeping, and Chef Marco agreed to train a small crew. The kitchen opened in a converted storefront near the train tracks, in a room that smelled like lemon cleaner and old wood and freshly poured coffee. There were booths, a coat rack, and a list on the wall of who would cook on which night. Maria stood at the center and felt the strange geometry of power around her. She accepted help, and without accepting it, she agreed to a visibility that made her both safer and more vulnerable. The community kitchen served soup, stews, bread, and a complicated menu of promises. It began to feed dozens a month. And the first month, the number reached 300 meals. The city papers wrote a short piece about a new pilot kitchen that reduced street meals in a defined radius by measurable amounts. Community metrics began to be quoted like currency numbers, and that excited people in grant offices. But every gift invites an accounting. Lorenzo's presence invited scrutiny from Antonio, who had not given up on the idea that control was his currency. He moved men to wait at supply runs, to question delivery drivers, to plant doubts. The community felt the pressure in subtle ways. Donations were delayed, a local supplier received a call about the risk of dealing with a kitchen associated with Santoro, and Maria found her phone full of anonymous messages hinting at consequences if she did not comply with unwritten expectations. There were tensions that could not be smoothed with soup and blankets. At a meeting in the kitchen office, Maria and Angela and Naomi argued about transparency. Angela said, "We need an audit." Naomi said, "We need a safety plan." Maria said, "I need to keep cooking." Agent Antonio's men did not like the audit suggestion. Daniel, the accountant, volunteered to prepare a concise financial protocol and invited Inspector Diaz to look over it. When Inspector Diaz came, he made a series of recommendations for segregation of funds, a public ledger for the community kitchen that would show where every dollar went, and a firewall between donor and program decisions. The idea was to retain the donation, but remove the possibility of direct leverage. The procedural description of auditing is important to understand how power is mediated. An audit required a formal request to a certified auditor, the collection of bank statements for a calendar quarter, cross-referencing of invoices to receipts, and a verification of volunteer timesheets. The auditor issued a provisional compliance certificate pending a control improvement plan that Daniel agreed to implement. The report of the audit was technical and clear and used terms like segregation of duties and reconciliation. It concluded that funds had been used for programmatic costs and recommended public posting of monthly ledgers. That process, 250 to 350 characters in its core, read like this in practice. Funds are reconciled weekly with 2 signatories for withdrawals, receipts are scanned and archived, and a public ledger is published monthly to the community mailbox and the nonprofit webpage. This operational transparency made the donations less attractive as political currency. Tension built toward a turning point when Antonio escalated. The men who had been shadowing supply runs blocked a van one night and demanded to know where large crates intended for the kitchen were going. A delivery driver named Javier, who was only trying to make a living, refused to give them the keys, and they slashed a tire and left a warning written on the van in marker. News spread, and fear crept into the kitchen volunteers. Maria received a call that told her to meet someone at midnight by the tracks if she wanted to avoid trouble. She went and found not a negotiation, but a rapid movement, a shove, a warning, and the implication that refusal would mean harm to people she loved. She thought of her niece, who would lose a babysitter, and of Lillian, who had become a small orbit of the kitchen. The confrontation ended with a shove and a bruise and the realization that the project could cost more than goodwill. At the climax, the threat became physical and public. Antonio tried to take a delivery of canned goods by force, and a scuffle broke out in front of the kitchen. Volunteers screamed, a metal pallet jack clanged, and Maria stepped between a man who would have been pushed to the ground. The scene was raw, sensory terror, the smell of adrenaline, the metallic taste of fear, the thump of fists on wooden crates. Police arrived after a motel clerk called 911, and a tense standoff occurred in a parking lot under sodium lights that cast long orange shadows. Lorenzo appeared with a small, unmarked car, and he stood at the edge of the fray. He did not fight, he did not raise his voice, he simply walked up and opened his palms. He said to Antonio, in a voice that found the center of the alley, "You have taken enough." He said to Maria, "You will not be alone." He offered a settlement and a choice. He would compensate damages, pay for a security detail for 3 months, and arrange for a legal channel to move supplies without interference. In return, he asked that the kitchen remain neutral territory and that Maria accept ongoing oversight from a board that included his trusted people. The offer was not a demand. It was protection in exchange for surrender of a kind to a governance that would include men whose first loyalty was to him. Maria stood on the asphalt, smelling diesel and cold, and thought about dignity and debt and a capacity of power to do good if it kept itself in bounds. She accepted with a hand that shook. The rescue, the settlement, and the choice that followed left an ambiguous imprint. The kitchen functioned. People ate. Maria received a check that cleared a rental notice and paid hospital bills and allowed her niece to enroll in a small daycare. Lillian gained a bed in a shelter and slowly learned to sleep without an ear tuned for footsteps. Antonio retreated for a while, and the street found a relative calm. The community kitchen became a place where dignity could be reclaimed through a bowl and conversation. Volunteers like Naomi and Angela built programs to teach resume writing and life skills and tracked metrics that they presented at a town hall. The numbers were simple, useful, and human. The first 3 months, the kitchen served 3,000 meals and enrolled 60 people in job training. The next quarter, attendance stabilized and community donations covered operating expenses. An anonymous donation of a larger sum helped to renovate the space and install a proper walk-in cooler. But the moral ledger remained unsettled. People whispered about who was behind the funding and whether gratitude would be transduced into obligations later. Maria accepted that protection and gratitude sometimes arrive braided together, and that the man who called her mother might also one day ask for a favor that would make her stomach turn. She found herself mediating between people who needed the kitchen and men who wanted influence. She organized a board that included Angela, Naomi, Daniel, Inspector Diaz, and Chef Marco as a guardrail. She insisted on monthly public ledgers and on the auditor's signature. She refused demands that the kitchen be used for any political meetings. Yet she also took small calls where Lorenzo asked a favor to host a discreet family dinner for a client who had been charitable before, and she did not always know how to say no. The language of gratitude and obligation wrapped around her life. As the calendar turned, the epilogue unfolded across months in a form that measured both progress and the slow negotiation of power. 1 month later, the community kitchen was humming with a steady rhythm. Volunteers arrived like clockwork, the freezers were stocked, and Lillian had a small schedule of shifts as a dining room greeter. The board met, and Daniel presented a report that balanced the books. There was a minor protest from a neighbor group about the involvement of outside money, but the board opened its minutes and published them, and the protesters quieted. Maria sat on a crate and wrote menus and listened to people tell their stories. She felt the weight of having been both rescued and recruited into a web she had not chosen. Her niece was enrolled in daycare and sent her drawings, crude suns and crooked houses, and Maria kept them on the wall above the prep counter. The neighborhood began to talk in a different tone about dignity and soup and the small possibility that a kitchen could be a stabilizer.
3 months later, the kitchen had more momentum and more scrutiny. The audit certificate hung by the office door, and volunteers had become regular hires with modest stipends. The community measured success in numbers of meals and in return to work statistics, and in the appearance of fewer people sleeping near the tracks. Inspector Diaz visited and nodded at the ledger. Antonio made a show of peace by donating a pallet of canned goods, and the board accepted with little fanfare and an agreement that there be no public images. There were stories of a woman named Rosa who had found steady hours at a nearby bakery, and of a young man named Felipe who completed a mechanic course that Naomi had coordinated. The kitchen had begun to seed small change across lives. Maria had learned to give interviews that balanced.
If this story moved you, tell us in the comments. Have you ever helped a stranger and felt the consequences? What happened? Start your reply with, "I once helped," and then share a line or two. Your voice matters here, and other people reading will find courage or caution in what you say. We read these comments and we feature stories that follow the conversation. If you want to be part of this community of listeners, share your thought and tell us where you are from. That helps others see that similar choices are made in many places, and that small acts can lead to complex outcomes. Now back to Maria and how she learned to keep cooking while tracing the lines of who she could trust. The final thought lingers on a table where a bowl cools, and the city continues its restless breath. Maria learned that kindness may come with cost, and that protection can be a cloak and a chain. She also learned that community can reconfigure itself when someone refuses to look away. The kitchen kept serving, numbers were tallied, names were written down, and the street smelled less like diesel and more like soup simmering. The man who called her mother remained a presence, both generous and inscrutable. People in the neighborhood called him a patron. Some whispered over time that his help had strings, and others simply thanked him for the meals he enabled. For Maria, the most honest sentence she could give when asked later was simple and true. I fed someone, and it cost me my job, and it opened a door she would not have chosen on her own. If you were moved by this story, consider sharing it. Support a local initiative that feeds neighbors, and tell us in the comments about a small act that changed you. A bowl of soup does not erase every problem, but it can be the first move in a complicated dance toward dignity and belonging.